Hi, everyone. We're just going to wait for a couple more minutes as people join us, and then we will get started. Fantastic. I think we will kick off as others continue to trickle in and join us for this session. So good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're joining us from. Thank you for joining us on today, International Women's Day. Happy International Women's Day to all the incredible women out there that are joining us for this process, to celebrate and engage with our efforts to champion women's voices in the multilateral governance and reform conversation. Just to very quickly kick us off with a couple notes of housekeeping. We will have this session run from 10 to 11:30. We'll have the speakers present their papers as part of a series that we've been working on, and then we will open up for Q&A as well, and you'll be unmuted and given the option to unmute if you have a question, but please use the chat box to indicate that you have a question, or the Q&A function, so that we can come to you. We are live streaming on YouTube and also recording this, just so that everyone is aware. I am honored and delighted to be co-moderating this event with Maria Fernanda Espinosa, the 73rd President of the General Assembly and Executive Director of Global Women's Voices, Changes and Inclusion as well. I myself am Nadara Youssef, Global Governance Innovation Network Facilitator with the Stimson Center. And both of us are honored to be working with Coalition for the UN We Need as well. Just to kick this off, before I hand over to Maria to contextualize this process and provide a little bit of a briefing of why we're doing what we're doing with this policy series, I just want to, for the sake of our audience as well, give you a little brief of what the Our Common Agenda process actually entails, why we're engaging on this, and then I will hand over to Maria. So, coming off the back of the UN 75th anniversary, many of you probably engaged with the UN 75 campaign. There was a political declaration that identified 12 priority areas to sort of go forth into the centenary of the United Nations, and areas that we want to reform and work on. It also, in the UN 75 political declaration, asked the Secretary General to report back within a year of how we can advance these 12 priority areas. So the Secretary General's response to the UN 75 political declaration was the Our Common Agenda report, with 90 recommendations across 4 thematic pillars, and several sort of operational tracks of how we can go about working on these priority areas headed into the centenary of the United Nations. Maybe one of the most influential recommendations that came out of the Our Common Agenda report was the call for a Summit of the Future, originally in 2023, but now it will be a ministerial meeting in 2023 and a Summit of the Future itself in 2024, where several operational tracks, including along the lines of peace and security, future generations, global economics, and so much more, will be discussed for reform and negotiation. Several negotiation tracks are currently taking place as well, with co-facilitators appointed for the Summit of the Future process, but also different thematic tracks that are taking place. So this is our attempt to apply a slightly different lens to the Our Common Agenda reform proposal conversation. And to tell you a little bit more about that initiative, Maria Fernanda, over to you.
Thank you so much, dear Nudara. First of all, happy Women's Day. This is a very special day I am a strong believer that every day should be Women's Day. And I think that there is a lot to celebrate. There's so many strides that our generation and the previous generations have made to ensure that women live safe with dignity and can enjoy their full rights. But we also know that there is a lot of work that we still need to do collectively. And that's one of the reasons why we're here. I have the privilege to be the executive director of Global Women Leaders Voices. We are a network of 62 women working for a feminist multilateral system. And we're very also happy to be part of the coalition for the UN We Need, very much engaged in the process of implementation of our common agenda. And I have the privilege to co-chair the coalition together with Dan Farrell. So very happy to have you all here and perhaps to share a little bit of the rationale of why we came up with this idea of having a set of policy briefs to inform the implementation of our common agenda, but more importantly, the discussions about the so much needed reform of the United Nations. First of all, we believe strongly that all issues in the multilateral scene are women's issues, and that we should go beyond the idea of that our agenda, it's about women's rights only. No, women and gender equality should be at the center, for example, of retooling our global financial architecture. We should be agents of transformation when we're talking about climate justice, and we should look at a feminist climate justice. We have to be at the center and core when we're thinking about the new agenda for peace, it's one of the proposals of our common agenda, and one of the proposals that is one of the key issues for the Summit of the Future in 2024, the role of women in global health, women representation and participation in global decision-making in general, how many women are leading in the international system, and basically to look at what are the priorities, the perspectives of women thinkers, of grassroots women for when we collectively think and build the UN we need and the UN we deserve for the future. So that's how this series of policy briefs came about. And basically what we want to do in very practical terms is inform the discussions, the dialogue, the negotiations that are going to take us through the Summit of the Future in 2024. So that's all from my end. Very much looking forward to hearing from the authors of the series, and over to you, Nudara.
Thank you so much, Maria Fernanda. And I will jump right into it and bring in our first author for this series, Fatima Kafki, who is the founder of the Arab Women Alliance, who wrote our paper on global governance for a feminist climate justice. So Fatima, straight over to you to kick us off.
Yes, I'll put the video on. Okay, thank you so much, and happy Women Month. I would call it Women Month actually, in order to, as Maria said, we should have it every day. So at least we should have it for a month now. And I'm so privileged actually to be among very eminent speakers today. And the paper is about a framework to climate justice, and I wrote it jointly with Sonia, and actually she's the one who encouraged me very much to write this paper with her. So thanks to Sonia for that. And Sonia rightly actually at the beginning of the paper she called for that elements of this feminist framework should be grounded on regional realities. And that's why I wrote about the Arab region. I come from this region, which has been very much suffering from climate change for many reasons that I would like to mention. We actually, have a rise in temperature already, scarcity of water in many of the Arab countries, sea level rise, and river and air pollution. Also, the region suffers from the armed conflict and occupation. So several of the countries are still under armed conflict, and women suffer a lot in this situation. And also from occupation. Just to give one example, in Palestine, Israel controls water in the West Bank, and also deprive 20% of the arable agriculture land in Gaza Strip, for example. We also suffer from cross-border dependencies between countries. So Iraq, for instance, depends on water from Turkey and Iran, and also Syria depends on water from Turkey. All this actually comes when women are in the region are very much suffering from structural disparities and discrimination, which have been increasing since COVID-19. And we see in all international and even national indicators that the situation of women is very much actually retreating. Just to give an example, there's very much feminization of agriculture in Egypt, and this is the sector that has been actually hit very much and is expected to be hit very much because of climate change. Women in the Arab region do most of the agriculture work. So 60% of the agriculture force, actually it's women who do the work, but they don't own the land they work on. For example, in Egypt, only 5% of the agriculture land is owned by women. The maximum female ownership of land is maybe in Tunisia, 14%. And that's why when things are very much changing in agriculture sector, women have no say, actually. Women are not at all benefiting from any of the few technological change of the fertilizers, for instance, the irrigation system and so on. So they're outside, although they do all the work. Also, why do they only own such a little percentage of the agricultural land? Because of the inheritance system in the Arab region, where women actually inherit only half what men inherit. And this is so difficult to change, although, feminist groups have been asking for the change of this because things have changed. It is grounded on religious basis, but now women are really working a lot, gaining money, and they are not depending on men. They're not depending on their brothers or their cousins. So they should be really inheriting as much as men do, because inheritance is the only way to own land in the Arab countries. So this is, just one example of, how women are very much suffering from this. Now, also women in the Arab region suffer from the unpaid care work that they have to do all the time. Now we can see some of the negative impact because of climate change. There are a lot of early marriage because of poverty, and also among the refugee and migrant women. I want to end with a recommendation, because I come from an Arab state CSOs and feminist network, which covers 13 countries and have like 50 feminist NGOs from the different countries. And we work a lot on calling for climate justice and gender justice. And we try to influence our governments. And we have put, several recommendations. And the most important ones is that there is a need for data and information about climate change, and especially gender disaggregated data information, because women are not, especially rural women, migrant women, refugees, are not at all reached with what is happening in the environment. What changes are we witnessing? What should they do actually? And all the information is missing. Also, we are calling for a gender perspective that should be all in policies, in reports. We want the civil society to participate in negotiations, in delegations, and we want also to see that the gender climate action plans are in the countries of the region. They should be monitored, and they should be the civil society should be given the space actually to monitor it with the government. On the finance, we find, some women are really doing fantastic things, especially women who are in agriculture or who are garbage collectors, and they have no way to reach any finance, even to encourage them with the little, they themselves create, some technological changes so that they can adapt and mitigate. Just to give an example, we have 100,000 garbage collectors, for instance, in Egypt. Half of this number are men who are collecting garbage from houses in Egypt, but the other half, who are women, are really doing the recycling themselves. They do papers, they do clothes, they do hangers, they all this, but with no support whatsoever. And I'm taking just an example from the grassroots thing, but it goes all over, that women are not really reaching the finance, and we're calling for this. We need to change the norms and stereotypes, because women should be really inheriting, should own the land that they work on. I'll stop here and thank you so much. I'm sorry if I really exceeded my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatma. First of all, for giving us the perspective of an Arab woman and what is happening in the Arab region when we speak about the impact of the climate crisis. And just a quick question to you, and I know that you made it so clear that responses to the climate crisis need not only a gender lens, but also a regional perspective. And you brought together, the climate crisis together with conflict. And I think that's extremely important, that we bring together the issue of human security and the climate crisis together. My question to you is, what are the things that you would like to see change in the overall global system to enable a better response, not only women as victims of the climate crisis, but, as you very well put it, women as agents of change and transformation. For example, your call of a gender-sensitive climate investment in areas like the Arab states, but of course beyond. What are the two things that you would like to see in the global architecture when we are asking for a greater climate justice? Over to you, quick answer, so Nudara can introduce the next speaker.
Yeah, actually, I would like to see at the global level also some sort of giving attention to the local level. Stories of women who are suffering because of climate change at a grassroots level should be really sort of listened to, should be recorded, because the needs actually in many cases are not addressed when policies at a global level are put. So I want to see this connection between, the global level being fed by the very local grassroots experiences of women, both on the negative side of what they suffer from, but also from the very good innovative small things that they do, but also they don't have access how to really sort of enlarge it, expand it, and make it clear.
Thank you, Fatma. Thank you so much. Very clear. We need the voices of grassroots women, of rural women, to be heard at the global level during the negotiations and the decision-making process. We heard loud and clear. Over to you, Nudara. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both so very much. I'm delighted to bring in the next two speakers who co-authored our paper on women in global health. Sarah Hawkes, founder and director of the Center for Gender and Global Health, and Professor Kent Boost, director of the Healthier Society Group out of the George Institute for Global Health. So over to both of you for some remarks on your paper.
Thank you very much, Nudara. And I mean, in following the scene set by Fatima and yourself, happy International Everything to all women out there, and recognizing the just gone centenary of the origins of International Women's Day. A huge thanks for bringing together a panel of people concerned with the international nature of women's struggles for equality, which I think speaks right back to the 1910 origin of why we're celebrating March the 8th. I'm going to speak very briefly on the content of a paper that we have written that looks at women and health, and then Kent is going to speak more broadly to our recommendations. So in our paper, when we think about women and health, we're thinking really along two interlinked lines. One is recognizing that in order for women to achieve gender equality, that sexual and reproductive health and rights are absolutely fundamental. And in the paper, we recognize not only that gender equality is unachievable without women's rights to bodily autonomy and rights to information and decision-making over their own sexuality and their own reproductive lives, but we recognize that we are in a time of particular pushback on those rights and principles in a number of countries around the world. But we also recognize in the paper that women's health goes beyond sexual and reproductive health, and that if we look at the major burdens of disease and the major causes of premature mortality around the world in almost every country except the very poorest, that it is the non-communicable diseases and problems of mental health that are the major causes of women's ill health and lack of well-being. And to be honest with you, when we look at those causes of illness, we're then plunged much more into the territory of thinking about the SDGs as a framework for addressing how we achieve good health and well-being for everybody. And what we call for in the paper is a fundamental shift away from thinking about health as simply the access to health services and the rights that people have, recognized in many constitutions around the world, recognized in many global agreements around the world for access to health, meaning access to health systems, but instead thinking about how we create health promoting environments. So if I reflect on Fatima's talk about climate change and the climate crisis and global heating, for example, we see that climate changes affect women's health more than they affect other sections of society, because, for example, women's underlying rates of anemia mean that when you have food insecurity related to climate change, women are more likely to suffer and become sick. So we have situated health very much in the realm of public health and looking at the social, the economic, the commercial, the legal, the political determinants of why people are at risk of being sick in the first place, and thinking about how we address those determinants. And the second part of the paper that I'll address very briefly is about women's role as workers in the health system. And I'm not even going to touch on women's role as unpaid laborers in the social care system, across all societies. But thinking about the formal health system, we have had since the 1970s formal health systems that have been built on the backs of women's unpaid labor, for example, as community health workers. And even when women are in the paid workforce in the health system, they are on average, according to ILO, earning 20% less than men in the health system. And their chances of becoming leaders in the health system are much lower than men's chances of becoming leaders in the health system. And if we take an intersectional lens to that, the work that Kent and I do as part of a global accountability mechanism we run, a gender accountability mechanism, sees that of 2,000 board members in the global health sector, only 15 are women from low-income countries. So we have huge inequalities, not only in health outcomes, but in the health workforce. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Really a very powerful outlook of what is the situation of women, not only in the health workforce and in positions of leadership in the health sector, but all this approach of health, going beyond health services, but looking at all determinants, the political, social, economic determinants for a healthy society. So extremely powerful case. I turn over now to your co-author, Kent. Welcome. And share with us, what are the key recommendations with this outlook that Sarah shared with us? What would be the key recommendations? What is that you would like to see when we are designing this new pact for the future? Over to you, Kent.
Maria Fernandez, thanks for having me. And I just want to start by paying my respects to all the people that are involved in the UN We Need process. And I'm obviously delighted to be here on International Women's Day with you, charting a feminist future for the multilateral system. So thank you. So Sarah's made an urgent and I think compelling case for the kind of changes we need, the kind of shifts that we need in our approach to health and gender. And it leads to several recommendations that we make in the paper. And I'm not going to cover them all today. I'm just going to make 5 quick points. But then we have recommendations for civil society, including trade unions, for the private sector, for member states, for the multilateral system. And so my first point really is that these are mutually reinforcing. And we need action on all fronts. So that, for example, civil society can push member states for the kinds of things that we're calling for. So the second point I want to make, and it's reinforcing one of the points that Fatima made, and so we see some similarities across sectors here, is the point around data. And it sounds pedestrian, it sounds technical, but it's actually political. We need more disaggregated data. And it's about knowing who's getting what, and we can't really get to, we can't monitor who's being left behind if we don't have, at a minimum, sex disaggregated data. I mean, in terms of this conversation, but as Sarah said, that's we need disaggregation across a number of in an intersectional way. So that's my first point, is reinforcing Fatima on sex disaggregated data. The second point, following on from Sarah, is this notion of that gender and health are interconnected and indivisible, and that we need just to be looking at health continuously with this feminist lens. And I think that this is something that Maria Fernandez brought up in her introductory remarks. We need to look at the gendered environments in which children play, in which people work, where they live, and so on. The third, and so hence, we'd only need that sort of gendered perspective on health. We need to see that reflected in political declarations, in policies, in programs, and investment. And I think that following on from that, 2 points. One is that right now, at least in the health sector, and very much so across the SDGs, is that we have a lot of fragmented accountability systems. And given that these issues are interconnected, we need more shared platforms to bring accountability systems together so that we're not thinking it always in these silos. And then I think following on from that as well, that we need the human rights machinery more generally to integrate feminist perspectives and gender into everything they look at, basically. And so we're coming at this from a health perspective, but it's across the SDG board that we want to do that. We think these things are doable. But at the same time, we recognize, as Sarah was saying, that there is a backlash, a movement against women's autonomy and sexual reproductive health and rights. And so my concluding remark is really that we need to be in this struggle together. We need to advance this struggle together. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kent and Sarah, for a great paper. And we heard you. Accountability systems, disaggregated data, a human rights approach, a human rights perspective to this, and translate the women's lens and perspective in global health, in concrete policy decision making and leadership. So excellent, and thank you once again. Over to you, Nudara.
Thank you so much, Maria. And I think we're starting to see across these papers trends of intersections as well, which is interesting for us as we start to consolidate all of our research. So to bring in our next author who presented our paper on women's representation and participation in global decision-making, so sort of multilaterally recommendations for a gender-equal multilateral system. Here is Marissa Conway, CEO of UNA UK. Marissa, over to you.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Amazing, perfect. Happy International Women's Day, everyone. And I'm very, very excited to be with all these other wonderful people contributing to this series of papers. I specifically spoke to women's representation and participation and focused on the 5th commitment in our common agenda, which is placing women and girls at the center. So specifically, this calls for repealing gender discriminatory laws, promoting gender parity, facilitating women's economic inclusion, including the voices of young women, and eradicating violence against women and girls. So I want to first start out by recognizing, and I think we'll probably all be in agreement, that multilateral spaces have very much been the realm of men. And it's only relatively recently in history that women have been welcomed into foreign policy spaces and these kind of institutions. And so continuing this push for greater diversity in representation and participation is absolutely critical for nuanced and effective policymaking, by increasing the range of lived experiences that informs policy decisions and the policymaking process. This will only lead to more well-rounded policy decisions, a more well-oiled democracy. So I want to start out by just acknowledging that, without this piece in place, it's not possible to achieve gender equality in multilateral spaces. And at the same time, I want to invite us to think a bit beyond what this can mean. So I often, when I talk about these things, people ask about, by including women, are we going to have inherently more peaceful, just more peace, I suppose, more peace-oriented policies? And I think the answer is no. I don't think we can equate the inclusion of women and representation of women with greater peace. And I'll kind of go into why. We all operate in various degrees in societies which are shaped by systems of oppression. So patriarchy, capitalism, white supremacy, these all shape societal norms and societal hierarchies. And this often means that people in leadership positions have to adapt to these hierarchies in order to be taken seriously and in order to be welcomed into these decision-making spaces. So I think there is a degree to which we can say increasing women in global decision-making is important, but we also have to take a step back and recognize the wider context that we're operating in, and at the same time, really push to challenge these systems of oppression and focus on institutional reform, so that we don't end up with this kind of add and stir scenario, as it's referred to, where we just sprinkle in some women and expect more peaceful results. I think that's also kind of unfairly placing the burden of peace on women when it should be everyone's responsibility. The UN, of course, has played a very large role in establishing women's representation as a new norm. And I think our common agenda does a really good way of trying to integrate this in across many different aspects, both at a multilateral level and at a national level as well. And this is very important as we're seeing a huge pushback on women and girls' rights. I live in the UK now, but I grew up in the States, and the pushback on reproductive rights is very, very scary to watch. And this isn't happening just in the US. This is happening globally. And there are a lot of anti-rights actors and anti-rights states that use the UN to push their agendas and their aims. I think a good example is looking at Security Council resolutions on women, peace, and security as states using these opportunities to try and limit language around gender equality and reproductive rights. And I think making sure that our common agenda takes this stand that the UN will not be a space where that can happen, and where women's rights is an absolute cornerstone of what the UN means and what operating in the UN means. This is hugely, hugely important to reshaping global norms and reshaping these systems of oppression. So I list a couple different kind of action items, recommendations at the end of my paper. The first one being linking short-term goals with long-term goals. So I kind of touched on this already, but what I mean by that is looking at what I consider to be a short-term goal, which is women's representation. This is about inclusion in existing systems. And in order to be effective, I think we need to partner this with longer term goals, which are about systemic change. So without both, it's very hard to make progress. And you need to partner this increase in women's representation with this long-term vision of reducing the influence of patriarchy, of white supremacy in multilateral spaces. And this will allow people to be more authentic in bringing their life experience to the table and using that as an informant to policymaking. The second is to integrate intersectional perspectives. And in using a feminist lens, I think while gender equality is the heart of feminism, it also allows us to look at power dynamics as a whole and look at how someone's social categories, all the ways that they identify themselves, can give them access to power or prevent them from accessing power based on these hierarchies of oppression and of power. So by taking this intersectional lens, we kind of very quickly get away from only looking at gender equality, but also start to think about racial equality and et cetera, which again is absolutely crucial to truly building a gender equal multilateral system. My third recommendation is, I'm sure we'd all agree, follow the lead of feminist civil society. The feminists who are on the ground doing this day-to-day work, they know what needs to happen. And if we're ever at a loss of what to do or where to go, it's a feminist civil society that we must look They will shine the light, they will shine the way forward. They've been doing this work for hundreds and hundreds of years and have all the answers, in my opinion. We only need to give them more attention and give them more money. My fourth recommendation is to link the local and the global, and specifically ensure policy coherence. So a lot of these recommendations about securing a gender equal multilateral system, I mean, you know, it goes without saying that these can't be implemented if the people who make up these spaces, the states that convene at the General Assembly in the UN, if they are not also convinced of this. So we need to have this linkage between what happens at national levels, what happens at community levels, and what happens in multilateral spaces, and draw a really clear through line between all of these different spaces. And I think this will provide some real power behind initiatives like our common agenda. And then I kind of just mentioned this, but my last recommendation is appropriate funding. So a lot of this work has been done for free by a lot of women, a lot of feminists who are so passionate about these issues, and funding feminist work is very difficult. So I would love to see initiatives that put money to grassroots feminist movements and help them have their voices heard in these halls of power from which they've been historically excluded. Because women's representation doesn't just mean, you know, who the UN representative is for that state, but it also means bringing in civil society. I'll wrap up now because I know we're short on time, but
yes, please, Marisa.
I just want to end by saying that our common agenda, I think, is just an absolute cornerstone to really institutionalizing feminist values at the UN, and I'm very excited to see it.
Thank you so much, Marisa. You're so right. Multilateral spaces have historically been male-dominated, and there's so much work to do. As you know, GWL just recently, a few days ago, launched this study using 33 of the biggest multilateral organizations, and it turned out that from 335 positions internationally during their life history, only 44 were women in these leadership positions, and 13 out of the 33 organizations have never had a woman leading at the top level. So there is a lot of groundwork to do. Thank you for the short-term, long-term goals. Of course, more structural and profound changes, and more, low-hanging fruits that we can act on immediately. So I think that I wouldn't. You were so clear about the recommendations, Marisa. Your 5 recommendations are really going to feed the Summit of the Future preparations, the Pact for the Future. So thank you very much for great work, and I would immediately turn over to Nudara.
Thank you so much, both Maria Fernanda and Marisa, for your remarks. We will, just to also clarify, we will put all of these papers up on the GWR website, the Coalition for the UN We Need website, and we'll share them around as well so that you'll all be able to have access to them. I do also encourage you to use the Q&A function in the chat box, because we will be shortly opening up to the floor to be able to ask questions as well. So we have a couple authors before we bring in our last 2 authors who are on the call today. We have a few who weren't able to join us because, as CSW is, there's sort of several things going on at the same time. So just to also shout out that Corey Levine, who is a human rights and peace building policy expert, wrote a paper on women, peace and security as part of the new agenda for peace and to combat gender-based violence. So again, we will share those papers around. And Aarti Krishnan, who is an alumni tech and human rights fellow at the Harvard Kennedy Center, but also is a strategic foresight consultant for UNDP, wrote our paper on digital ethics and governance. And just very quickly, Aarti has sent over a couple bullet points that I'll read for the team, just to read for the group, just to give you some clarity of what she proposed as well. So these are in Aarti's words: digital futures are not neutral, nor are those that advocate for its expansion or its mitigation neutral either. There are complex reasons behind this, and digital systems exist within complex imperial formations. She also says data governance protocols that have been designed to date, though worthwhile, can be narrow in its application. It narrows the focus of governance on issues such as data and AI, rather than the broader governance of the use of digital systems within the systems it intersects with. She moves on to say current codes of ethics are limited in that they are not binding like the law and hence do not promulgate compliance. They often reflect the value of the organization that create them rather than the diversity of those who potentially are impacted by AI systems, and they are not automatically operationalized by those designing and applying AI tools on a daily basis. She concludes with, what we need is digital ethics and governance frames that specifically aim at interrogating and analyzing context, motives, and impact of use over a long-term time frame. This focus is to enable safeguards to be built in to ensure a broader accountability to public interest, as well as ensure that practices and frameworks do not inadvertently or advertently obstruct people's current and new rights. So that's just a quick summary of what Aarti did in her paper on decolonizing and the digital ethics and human rights surrounding the global governance negotiations. Moving on then to the final paper that our authors will present today on a European feminist foreign policy. We have from the Foundation for Progressive Studies, Aline Bernet and Letitia Thiessen. So over to both of our authors.
Hello, hello everyone. I'm delighted to be with you here today. I'm also perhaps waiting for my colleague Aline to join, because this is a paper that we are very much excited to present to you and to also be part of this series that we had a lot of pleasure contributing to. So first of all, a big thanks for all the organizers of this important and very timely initiative. Happy International Women's Day to everyone. I think the opening of the CSW was very clear, and Antonio Guterres very well illustrated the fact that there is a strong call and need to intervene in the field precisely because due to the different backlashes in the field, we are seeing a very strong risk of regression when it comes to women's rights, and therefore it's quite crucial that we also manage to take a concrete action and transformative action in the field of feminist foreign policy. So we are delighted to contribute, and perhaps just a few more words about the organization that we represent. So we represent FEPS, the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, which is the think tank of the progressive political family at EU level. And so our mission is to develop innovative research, policy advice, training, and debates in order to inspire and inform progressive politics across Europe. So in our paper, specifically dealing with the European dimension, what we first ask is why do we need a feminist foreign policy? And in so doing, we try to fill the gap in the debate on the Europeanization of the issue, because many times, of course, we speak about the different national plans that have been set up, but not so much when it comes to the European dimension. And therefore, we build on the context of what can be considered a feminist turn in foreign policy in order to reflect on the opportunities and challenges of more clearly linking at the European level, on the one hand, the external action, and on the other, the gender equality agenda, to make it the truly European feminist foreign policy. And despite the significant advances that we have seen with the adoption of feminist foreign policy by some national governments, a more ambitious, progressive, and transformative approach must be continuously advocated by feminist actors. In particular, the European Union should be more determined to adopt feminist principles in its own external action. Given its normative power in international politics, a feminist foreign policy at the European Union level represents a true opportunity to amplify the promotion of gender equality and the empowerment of marginalized groups. As Europe is indeed finding itself in one of the most severe security crises, there is a strong momentum to transform its external action. And at the same time, the feminist branding of foreign policy also precisely coincides with the increased political commitment to gender equality through numerous initiatives, not least through the gender equality strategy, but also the LGBTIQ strategy that was launched by the European Union. So one may also wonder at the first place, what is a feminist foreign policy? And what is pretty clear here is that it should not just be another buzzword, but much more than that, it is a process and a comprehensive approach to foreign policy. It can be understood as a political framework. And as such, feminist foreign policy takes a step outside of the black box approach of traditional foreign policy thinking, and its focus on military force, violence, and domination by offering an alternative and intersectional thinking of security from the viewpoint of the most vulnerable. And so as such, it also closely connects with the grassroots feminist movements and the experience of civil society organization. It is also an exercise to value to apply those values abroad, but also and especially at home. And in that sense, it's about a self-reflection exercise regarding foreign policy, and it requires questioning one's own internal organization structures and practices to actually be able to walk the talk and free foreign policy from all structural power relations. And moreover, it applies to all international efforts. So that concerns peace and security, but also trade, development, diplomacy, immigration, and so on. And in the same way, it also looks in the long-term challenges and the various factors affecting human security, including social and economic development, healthcare, access to welfare services, conflict prevention, and women's rights. And so in that sense, feminist foreign policy constitutes a multi-dimensional policy framework aiming to elevate women and marginalized groups. So now, if we apply this theoretical framework to how this is put in practice, we soon realize that these efforts are actually rooted in a long-standing multilateral development and normative framework. In fact, it was already starting in 1979 with the UN CEDAW Convention, which is the reference international legal instrument that requires countries to eliminate discrimination against women and girls in all areas. Of course, then in 1995, we had the Beijing Declaration, which was a decisive turning point for the global agenda on gender equality, and which is also highlighting women's essential role in the achievement of lasting peace. And with a more specific focus on feminist peace, the adoption of the UN Security Council 1325 has been the very first to actually recognize the importance of women's perspective and involvement in peace and security in such an explicit manner. And it has also as such contributed to establishing the so-called Women, Peace and Security agenda. So that means that when Sweden came up with its very first feminist foreign policy, it was actually a concept that was far from unknown. And yet it was met with a lot of resistance, if not ridicule. Nevertheless, it has also produced tangible results and concrete changes, and also at the same time encouraging other countries to follow suit, with the known example of Canada, France, Mexico, Spain, and most recently Germany, that has launched its guidelines for feminist foreign policy just a week ago. And so it encourages a deep reflection on the meaning of feminism, because it forces foreign affairs officials to actually rethink what it means before applying the notion to their work. And basically, in other words, it requires us to consider everything through a gender lens and highlight the need for gender perspective in areas that have been considered gender neutral by default. The Swedish perspective is namely known for its triple R rule, which is revolving around ensuring the rights of women, ensuring adequate resources that are channeled in gender-sensitive budgeting, and the representation of women in politics, as has been already underlined multiple times in this discussion. And therefore, making feminist foreign policy a reality demands a radical shift to conceiving foreign policy, and the recent withdrawal of the new Swedish government clearly also shows its very fragility. reality. And therefore, the question ahead of us is whether the European Union has the potential to help advance the objectives of a feminist foreign policy globally. And that is something that my colleague Aline is going to elaborate on in further detail. Thank you.
Thank you. Could Aline be very, short so we can give some time for the reactions and for the Q&A at the end. So Aline, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I will be short and I will focus on the recommendations that we put forth. So actually our paper does this exercise of reflecting of a possible Europeanization of a feminist foreign policy, whether the European Union as a multilateral body could adopt and apply, put in its practice of relations with other countries, a feminist foreign policy. So in order to put forth some of the recommendations that we make in this paper, and I will get to them, there are 4. We also we looked into we made a bit of a diagnosis of what is the situation now. Of course, that the European Union has already taken important initiatives, especially to promote gender equality domestically at the level of the European Union, but we don't see too much a clear link between the gender equality strategies at the European Union level and the external action of the European Union. So one of our recommendations is actually to link these 2 initiatives more clearly. And just to give you an idea of the kind of diagnosis that we got into when looking into the initiatives and the way that external policy at the European Union is currently conducted, we actually found that there is quite a traditional approach to external policy for the moment. There is a lack of gender mainstreaming within the European External Action Service in particular, which is the service that deals with external relations of the European Union. And there is a clear underrepresentation of women in various parts of the EEAS. For instance, almost 80% of senior and almost 70% of middle management posts in the European External Action Service are held by men. And we also saw a similar pattern of male dominance in domains of external action in the European Parliament, with the central committees and subcommittees dealing with external action not being very gender balanced and not reflecting the increased representation of women as it has happened in the level of the European Parliament. So when it comes to our policy recommendations, and I invite you all to read the paper, we formulate 4 policy recommendations for a more critical, ambitious, and progressive European feminist foreign policy, which does not exist as such for now. But we think that there are elements there already, and especially in the internal strategy of gender equality promotion of the European Union. So first recommendation, the European Union should adopt a more ambitious approach and a more inclusive concept of feminist foreign policy and of the notion of gender itself, because it hasn't explicitly adopted a feminist approach so far, and the concept of gender equalities is still a bit limited, referring mostly to equality between women and men, so still a very binary perspective, which is not fully inclusive. Of course, that the European Union also has to recognize its historical legacy as a former imperialist power and reflect internally how existing policies might eventually be reproducing itself. As a second recommendation, we put forth that there should be adopted reforms in the EU institutions that promote equal composition, more inclusive and participatory processes, and an increased dialogue with civil society actors. And here I see that there's a lot of convergence and synergy with previous recommendations. A third recommendation that we propose is to increase the internal and external policy coherence by adopting feminist perspectives across different foreign policy domains. So we've mentioned trade, development, security and defense, and so on. And also coherence between what the EU is doing internally and externally. So as Laetitia said, the EU has to do as it preaches. And finally, for an EU blueprint for feminist foreign policy, we think that adopting a European feminist foreign policy is also a way to make it more cohesive and intersectional, and to to promote a unifying factor, trying to overcome the ideological divisions and political divisions across this framework of feminist foreign policy. And we see that there is an opportunity at the level of the European Union, especially because of its normative power at international affairs, and also its huge network of working in partnership with the Global South and all over the world.
Thank you.
Yeah, these would be our recommendations.
Thank you so much, Aline. Indeed, a very powerful piece of work, and basically the next homework ahead of us is how to translate this idea of a feminist foreign policy to to the larger geography, and to see how the feminist foreign policy informs the reform of the United Nations, in what ways, and this dialogue, this North-South dialogue, I think it's extremely important for the future that we want, which is a feminist multilateral system. So thank you for great work, Aline and Leticia, and over to you, Nudara, for the next speaker.
Thank you so much to Aline and Leticia for their work on this paper. And they've sort of gone into sort of very comprehensive data analysis and graphing as well in their report. And so we do encourage you to look at that as we share the link around. We're going to move into sort of the reactionary phase of this panel now for the last 25 odd minutes. And to kick us off with our sort of respondent, someone who is both very aware of the feminist sort of space and framework and has been the former chair of CSW, but who has also sort of engaged with the CSW moment happening now and the different practicalities and realities of the UN system. So it's my pleasure to invite Dubravka, a former chair of CSW and CEDAW expert and former special rapporteur on violence against women, to just provide us with some brief reactions to the papers and anything that you'd like to share with the group.
Greetings to all, and let me also start by congratulations to all of International Women's Day. We are all meeting and we are having this panel at margins of the session of the Commission on the Status of Women. And as Maria Fernandez pointed out, at this point of time, it is really important also to see what is the current, what was the past, and what should be the future role of the CSW in discussing topics that we have discussed during this panel with respect to implementation of our common agenda, plan for the future, and all instruments that we have adopted up to now that were mentioned by some panelists, like CEDAW Convention, Beijing Platform for Action, but also other instruments that are at our disposal. We have also heard very important statements related to platform for synergies between all those instruments that we have developed throughout the years at the level of UN as a global organization. And Maria Fernandez also mentioned the reform process. So we are trying to reform and adjust to realities of today and needs of women and girls in different parts of the world. We are seeing this backsliding with respect to women's rights, and that was recognized also by UN Secretary General in his assessment of implementation of SDG agenda, and especially goal number 5 on achieving gender equality. And it was also mentioned during this panel that there are still discriminatory laws that were mentioned by the first panelist with respect to inheritance rights. In other parts of the world, there are other discriminatory laws and provisions that are still preventing women from enjoying women's rights as human rights. We are seeing pushbacks around the world, and we are seeing a backlash with respect to achieving gender equality. So now we are looking at number of years, how far away we are from our goals to achieve equal rights between women and men or substantive gender equality. And I would like to summarize somehow what we have discussed up to now by few points related to the CSW, because we are meeting at during the CSW session as a panel connected with the work of the CSW. And I think that it is really important to all UN member states and for all of us to discuss what was the past of the CSW. And we can see that during its past, CSW was the commission that was established in 1946, started to work in 1947. And during its past time, it have developed and elaborated all those instruments that we are using today. So it was the CSW who established this comprehensive gender equality framework now based on CEDAW Convention and Beijing Platform for Action, optional protocol to CEDAW, and also we have regional instruments that could be integrated in this agenda. But now what is the role of the CSW with respect to implementation of those instruments? We have seen that after adoption of the Beijing Platform for Action and first review and adoption of the outcome document, CSW changed its role into follow up to the implementation of the Beijing Platform for Action. And somehow it scaled down this comprehensive overview of different agenda items. So now it is important for states to see how to establish CSW back as a platform for all those issues that we have discussed today, for discussion related to health issues and synergies between different agendas, feminist foreign policy. Everything that we have touched today should be discussed at the level of the CSW. What is level of political participation of women around the world? Why we are having this slow progress instead of something that was predicted as a possible goal of SDG agenda. So I think that also it is a huge problem with addressing violence against women. It was mentioned that I was special rapporteur on violence against women for 6 years, and I was also CEDAW committee expert. So we are seeing that there is no sufficient connection between expert mechanisms and sessions of the CSW, knowing that CSW has developed those agendas on which those expert mechanisms are producing their reports and are functioning. So I hope that in the future, CSW will strengthen its human rights perspective and include all those experts in its work better in terms of having interactive kind of panels and discussions around reports produced by expert mechanisms, because they're all sent to CSW, but they are not discussed. And for example, when I was special rapporteur on violence against women, I have an elaborated report on online violence against women. That was a few years ago. And current focus of the session of the CSW is on online and digital violence against women. And we will see at the end of the session adopted agreed conclusions that should be follow up to the Beijing Platform for Action. But is it really follow up of the Beijing, or is it another set of standards that should upgrade what we have had up to now? So there are many issues that should be addressed, and I hope that we will also go in direction that were also mentioned by panelists, that we need more data, more comparable data, indicators, those things that will present what is happening in different parts of the world in terms of implementation of all those agendas, including our common agenda proposed by UN Secretary General. And he also called for elaboration of an emergency action plan on violence against women. So who is going to elaborate that action plan? It should be, in my view, the CSW that elaborated other action plans related to women's rights. But now we also have to go back to what was stated at the opening by Maria Fernandez. All the UN organs and agencies should include women's rights and concerns and gender mainstreaming into their work. But still, CSW should be a central one. At each session, that will open opportunity for all of us to see where we are, how we are progressing or regressing, and what are those tools that will push implementation in the right direction. And just last point, when CSW was established, it was at the same level as the Commission on Human Rights at that time as Functional Commission of Economic and Social Council. In 2007, we have upgraded Commission on Human Rights, and it was transformed into Human Rights Council. And Commission on Status of Women was never reformed and never had tools and mechanisms to follow up on real implementation at the national level. So I think that this is a challenge that should be addressed together with all those implementation measures related to our common agenda. And this panel was very important sign what are those areas that should be integrated in the work of the CSW. Thank you.
Thank you, Dubravka. Excellent. I think it was a very comprehensive overview, and thank you for the connection to CSW 67 and the conclusions that are to be adopted next week, and the homework ahead of us as we think about the pact of the future. So thank you so much. Over to you, Nudar.
Indeed, Maria. I think that was a really comprehensive overview, Dubravka, of not just our papers and how sort of the papers could fall into the global governance mechanisms, but also how it connects with what's happening across the street, kind of as we're speaking at the moment as well. I would like to invite all of our panelists now to turn their videos on as we go into the Q&A session for this call. And then we will bring in Soon Young for the closing to sort of round us off and give you a little bit of a timeline of what's going to happen next as part of our policy brief series. So just to kick us off, what we'll do is get a couple questions from the chat. We'll come back to specific members of our panel, and then we will go again into the chat box. Feel free to either use the chat box or the Q&A function. We are tracking both of them. So we had a question from Amaryllis Abreu. If Monique, you can help us unmute Amaryllis so that she can come in, they can come in and ask their question.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
Okay, so my name is Amaryllis, and my question was regarding the feminist foreign policies. I was actually asking if we have something similar at the national level, some frameworks at the national level regarding feminist national policies.
Thank you so much, Amaryllis. We're going to continue with a couple more questions and then we'll come back to the panel. We had a question from Dan Perel. Dan, if you would like to unmute yourself.
Thanks so much. I actually just wrote you a message saying I don't want to be unmuted. Let's hear from others. But you can see the question in the chat box is about theories of change. But of course, it comes after gratitude for all your hard work and excellent recommendations. One of the questions that I often love to hear from experts about is what are theories of change that can sort of overcome some of the various dichotomies we see around the world? You're in this camp or that camp. The recommendations that we've heard here and we hear across the street are frequently fantastic, but then there's an implementation gap. And so I'm very curious to hear your approach to these theories of change that can actually create sustainable solutions like those that you have proposed in your excellent papers. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Dan. And just one more question from the audience before we turn back to our panel. We had a question from Onyine. I do apologize for my pronunciation, and please could you unmute yourself and also introduce yourself as you ask your question.
Hello. Hey,
Hi.
Good evening. Can you all hear me?
We can indeed, yes.
Okay, so it's Oyinye, actually. So I think it's I'm so sorry if I get this wrong, Miss Marisa Conway. She mentioned something about, I think, bridging the gap between the global level and the local level. So I actually wanted to know, I'm more interested in that. And I must actually commend you all. You all are beautiful, strong, amazing women that are actually killing it. So I wanted to know, I'm actually very interested because I'm from Africa. And then we have like low network problems, we have low technical issues. So I wanted to know how that will happen if you maybe try using the policies, or you want to, make an act in country's constitution. So something. Yeah, thank you. Is my question understood?
Yes, got it. Thank you so very much for that. I think we have a couple specific sort of questions, I think. So we'll go to Aline and Letitia about the European policy one. We'll come to Marissa. And then if others want to jump in on the sort of more general theory of change question, please just unmute and we can jump in. So maybe to Aline or Letitia. I see Aline is unmuted, so over to you.
Yes, thank you, Nidara. Very quickly, and then I hand over to Letitia. So actually, what has been in place are national feminist foreign policies. And what we advocate in the paper is for a Europeanization of feminist foreign policy. So to make this also a principle and a practice at the European level. So at the national level, Sweden, Canada, France, Mexico, Spain, Luxembourg, Germany, Chile, and the Netherlands are some of the well-known countries that have already adopted a feminist foreign policy. And on the EU level, actually, there is no such a feminist foreign policy. The EU still lacks an approach to feminist principles to its external action, while it has some initiatives of strategies and policies for gender equality, justice, and inclusion at the internal level. And just very briefly to give a bit of context, since 2010, there were 2 gender action plans that have been adopted at the level of the EU. The last one expired in 2020, and recently there was negotiations around a 3rd gender action plan that establishes this feminist approach or gender equality approach to external policy. But unfortunately, it has not been agreed by the Council, although the European Parliament, for instance, has presented an ambitious approach to the GAP 3, but so far then there's no such European feminist foreign policy, and this is precisely what we advocate for in our paper. So I hand over to Letitia if she wants to add on the national feminist foreign policies.
Yes, indeed, complementing Aline's answer, as she already underlined, there are already a series of European countries that have pledged to a feminist foreign policy. The most famous cases would be France, Spain, Germany most recently. But then you have also other countries that, if they perhaps don't necessarily label their policies as such, they nevertheless integrate a feminist dimension into their foreign policies. And that would, for instance, be the case of Finland, Denmark, but also Norway outside of the European Union. We have also Scotland, for instance, that is an interesting case. And at the same time, beyond countries, what we also see and what we observe in the paper is that the adoption of feminist foreign policy is also applied, for instance, at the political level. So we see, for instance, political parties that make explicit pledges in their manifestos, like has been the case in certain countries. Now, at the same time, what we argue in the paper is that there is a strong need for a harmonization of feminist foreign policy, because we tend to use it as a generic term, but feminist foreign policy does not necessarily always mean the same in one country or another. And that is also why we see an important role to be played both at the European Union level or at the UN level to actually bring a sort of a uniform vision for what feminist foreign policy should look like. Should it be something that has to happen internally? Should it be something that is outward looking? So that is something that we strongly advocate for. And perhaps here also on the coming back on the European Union level, I would like also to mention that just yesterday there was a CSW side event where Stella Runner, who is the EU ambassador for gender and diversity of the European External Action Service, was actually sharing the information that, well, first of all, the European Union is providing a lot of assistance to people in Ukraine because of the current situation, and they have blocked out of the allocated budget 6 million to support survivors of war-related violence, for instance. So that is something also that should be mentioned, that the European Union is already looking at these different dimensions. We also recently had a paper by Anne Lind, who very well explained, and I highly encourage you, because we won't have the time to go into the details of this, but she very well illustrates how she, in her capacity as foreign affairs ministers, managed to push for feminist perspective in her role, both at the European Union level, but also at the UN Security Council, where, for instance, she insisted a lot on the need to consult with civil society.
Thank you so much, Letitia. I'm going to hand over to Marissa, and if we could keep our responses relatively brief so that we can squeeze in a couple more questions, that would be fantastic. So Marissa, over to you.
Thanks. So on kind of linking the local and the global, I'll try and make this quick. I think it's best to go from the local to the global. So that means looking at grassroots community activists who are operating in their own communities, in their neighborhoods, because they have the knowledge of what is needed, what people need, especially what historically marginalized people need, and then bringing that kind of up to the attention of national governments and then into the UN. So there are a lot of organizations that have this kind of pipeline in place to help deliver this sort of information. My organization is one, United Nations Association, and there's actually a United Nations Association in many, many countries. So I would encourage you to have a look and see if there's one close to you. And that focuses on building this local activism and bringing it through national governments, and having these national governments act in these interests. And I mean, in general, when it comes to, you know, what works best for you, for where you are from, I think you are the one to answer that question. I think if anyone who doesn't, you know, who's not existing where you are right now tries to tell you what's best, red flag. You know what you need. You are well connected to people who are, I'm sure, doing amazing work too. So I would start there, and I would encourage you to think about what's happening in your community already that you could get more involved with.
Thank you so much, Marissa. And I would also encourage our panelists to just keep an eye on the chat box, and if maybe respond to any additional comments in there as well, should they wish. We had a quick question about theory of change. I don't know if Sarah or Fatima, you'd like to specifically jump in on this. So I see Sarah nodding. Maybe if Sarah and Kent, you'd like to jump in on that question, and then we'll go back to the chat box for a couple questions and come back to our panel. So over to you.
So I'm nodding because, you know, we're academics. We live and die by theories of change. It's our bread and butter. So we've got pockets full of theories of change that we could share. But I mean, I think sort of fundamentally what we would say is that the best way of thinking about a theory of change is thinking about power and the distribution of power, and identifying the levers for where you can exact change or enact change when you understand how power is distributed and who holds the power for change to happen. But what I really wanted to say is that I think for us a more practical question, moving on from theory, is to push for accountability mechanisms, so that we're actually holding people and institutions to account for the commitments that they make. And in the work that we do, we call on the principles set out by the UN Special Rapporteur on the Right to Health, who identified 3 principles of accountability. So independence, transparency, and the ability to enact some kind of sanction when people don't meet their own and institutions don't meet their commitments. So it's kind of from theory to practice through accountability mechanisms.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Yes, Fatima, yes, if you want to add
Yes,
anything.
I have a comment on the second question, actually, about the relationship between global and local and grassroots. And I think we have to really differentiate between different regimes. In autocratic regimes, actually, it's very difficult from the local and grassroots level and national level to feed the global level and UN level, because governments are the ones who are feeding with the shrinking space, of civil society, and government, try to say that everything is fine for women, and they are the ones who are permitted to feed at the global thing. So there is a fear actually from civil society, from autocratic regimes, and to the extent that the governments are creating governmental NGOs, and they are the ones who are really supposed to and allowed to feed the global thing. And this is something really UN should take care of. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Fatima. 3 more very quick questions, and then we'll come back to quick responses from the panel and then close off. We have a question from Arissa Roy. So if we could unmute Arissa, that would be great. Followed shortly then by Elizabeth Schumann. So if Elizabeth, you can be ready to go. Arissa.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Hi, my name is Arissa Roy. I am a youth activist from Toronto, Canada, and I work primarily in SDG4, and I run my own nonprofit organization working alongside the UN. As a young person working in this space, I was wondering what is being done to ensure that youth are at the forefront of these conversations, of these future plans, and what are leaders needing to be doing in order to make sure that our voices are being equally heard and respected in these spaces? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Arissa. Elizabeth Schumann.
Thank you. I was not expecting to be on here. I just wanted to know if you have any advice for us who are not in government, how we can mobilize our fellow citizens to really know more what the UN does and how we can support it, especially in the topic that we're discussing.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And there's also a question in the Q&A for Dubravka. Fergus Watt asks, civil society had a large role in creating UN Women. How do you see the upgrading of CSW to a council coming about? So for more accountability, one presumes. So maybe we can kick off first with the question to Dubravka and then go from there.
Thank you very much for this question. And before that, just to address a previous question on implementation gaps. I think that implementation gaps are crucial, and we need to focus on implementation mechanisms that should be attached to all bodies that are adopting different platforms. For example, CSW would need to develop implementation mechanisms in order to really look into data, what is happening in terms of violence against women, femicides, and so on. And for example, I have proposed establishment of Femicide Watch that would really look into data and prevention of femicide. So it should be implementation tool, and we need such tools. In terms of CSW as a Human Rights Council, I think that this is something that should be really discussed. I'm really grateful for this question, but it is now on stage to see what was the past role of the CSW and what is the current limited role of the CSW, and how we should upgrade and expand the role of the CSW in order to enable it with tools and working methods and everything to address all those issues that are now relevant for women all over the world, and that should be channeled through United Nations. So I think that it could be a council on women's rights and statutes. It could be also the same name CSW, but it should be reformed and changed. It should be much stronger. The mandate should be implementation oriented, and it should be also supplemented with different working methods like UPR that will examine implementation of a Beijing Platform for Action, but also SDG agenda, our common agenda and plans for the future, all those issues that are relevant for further mainstreaming of women's rights in whole UN Women's Agenda. So thank you for this question.
Thank you so much, Dubravka. I will actually take that question on youth, just because, and I do encourage other panelists to jump in as well if they would want to add or also add to the chat box. But I speak with some level of legitimacy as the Global Youth Coordinator for Coalition for the UN We Need. I was also extensively engaged in the negotiations on the UN Youth Office and a couple other youth networks as well. So yes, Our Common Agenda proposed the UN Youth Office. So one of the key outcomes there is that the office is now coming out of the regular budget. It has a $2.1 million budget. It's going to have 16 staff members. The young person is going to be the youngest ever Assistant Secretary General appointed at the United Nations under the age of 35, who will lead the UN Youth Office as well. So I think Our Common Agenda in that front has had a big win with the youth agenda. But I think importantly, young people, as Arissa, you are engaging with SDG 4, need to be engaging outside of the youth agenda. Young people need to be engaging with parts of the agenda that don't necessarily say this is a youth problem. They need to be talking about global digital governance, global financial architecture, violence against women and girls. They need to be discussing feminist foreign policy and things that aren't traditionally boxed in the youth space, because that's when you're actually genuinely going to get youth perspectives on issues, aside from just youth perspectives on youth issues. And this is true also for women's agendas. Women need to be discussing everything under the sun, not just things that are deemed women's problems. So that's my quick response to that question. We will put links in the chat box for different ways for young people to get engaged as well. And Soon Young will be closing us out shortly about some perspectives on how you can engage. But the question about advice that Elizabeth had was just what is, as civil society, what can we be doing in these spaces? And I don't know if there's a better person to respond to this than Maria Fernanda herself, who is engaged in the UN system, engaged across civil society. So Maria, maybe if you could quickly respond to that and hand over to Soon Young to close us out.
Yeah, thank you, Nudara. And I think it's very simple. I think that we have to call on the first phrase of the UN Charter. We, the peoples of the United Nations. The United Nations, beating hard, has to be the voices of people. And we have to be strategic and active and creative to make sure that our proposals, our ideas just permeate or get through. I've served as a public servant several years. I'm on the side of civil society now, and I can see and feel the power of influence of civil society, groups of the willing among member states that we are working with. And this conversation today is just a first dialogue of many to come about the need, to put the women's rights and gender equality perspective throughout the discussion, the dialogue, and the decision-making on UN reform, both structurally and thematically. And I cannot agree more with Nudara. I always say that it's not about only women's issues and that we have to be consulted and have an opinion on women's issues. All issues in the international agenda are women's issues. So we have to be active. A little bit of an advertisement here. The 20 and 21st of March, we will be holding a huge interaction and debate, the Global Futures Forum. Stay tuned, register. It's going to be a hybrid format and have your voices heard. So this is going to be the food. It's going to be the seed for the upcoming Summit of the Future and the Pact for the Future. a pact for the future that is meaningful has to be co-created together with civil society, Elizabeth. That would be my words. Thank you again for this amazing panel. And I turn over to Sung Young to close this and to really give us some hints about what's next, what comes next. So over to you, Sung Young.
Not to close, but to open the space. So Nudara is going to put into the chat the link to register. The link to register for the next wonderful place where you can bring your ideas, your energy, which is that Global Futures Forum that will take place, as Maria said, 21st in March in hybrid form. So everyone can participate who is here. The Global Futures Forum has already mobilized groups through regional forums. Remember, we are going to focus on the 7 thematic tracks. If you don't know what those are, please come and learn about them, contribute. Consultations with youth and children, and e-consultations, including research like the research that we heard today. It's a civil society-led initiative to ensure really a true partnership, bring the power and creativity that we felt here today in all its diversity to this People's Declaration in order to present the UN Summit of the Future with civil society's voice. So that Summit of the Future may be a new idea to you. So I encourage you to also do some work and brief yourself on what that is. But that really is to accelerate the implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals in its great breadth, and to also strengthen the UN system. And as Dubrovka was saying, for us, starting with a CSW, an energized and better CSW is going to be a great starting point. So bring your visions, your hopes and dreams to this process, because we have an unusual opportunity to transform the UN for future generations. I've often said to my students that the feminist and women's movement is the most transformative, nonviolent social movement in modern times. This is not only our day, it is our time in history, and the UN can help us to write its future. Thank you so much.
What a closing. Thank you all.